think Ukraine has proven that it will not surrender, that it will not give up sovereign territory, and that increasingly it has not only the will to resist, but the means to resist. And it no longer is wholly dependent on Western support. The Kremlin fundamentally understands a reality, and that is that the brightest red line, perhaps in the global geostrategic setting, is the red line surrounding NATO territory, and that if that red line is violated, all bets are off. Are they willing to fully mobilize the Russian manpower potential in order to achieve President Putin's goals in Ukraine? It's not clear that they want to take that decision. It's certainly not clear that, short of full mobilization, that Moscow can prevail.
Welcome to Independent Avenue Media. My name is Kirill Sikhotsky. Where we are in Russia's war in Ukraine at the moment and what the West should do next. To discuss all this, I'm joined today by Douglas Lute, former US ambassador to NATO. But before we jump in, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media to get the latest analysis of US foreign policy when it comes to this region. Ambassador Lute, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's good to be with you.
Ambassador, the recent NATO summit in Turkey early in July showed a much warmer meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky. Do you think this is a sign that the thinking in the White House when it comes to the war in Ukraine has somewhat shifted?
Well, perhaps. And if it has shifted, it has probably shifted based on the evidence of the last 6 to 9 months. Where the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military have essentially seized the initiative against the Russians, and they've done this on 3 sort of levels. First, along the 600-mile front line, they've essentially frozen the front line, negated any Russian advances, and even made moderate advances themselves. Behind the front line, so think now 30 to 50 kilometers behind the front lines, the Ukrainians have isolated the Russian occupying forces. So these are something like 500,000 Russians who are on sovereign Ukrainian territory. And they've done this isolation by way of cutting off the supply lines that have reinforced and sustained these Russian occupiers. Most prominently, they have largely isolated the entire Crimea Peninsula. So that's at the sort of operational level. And yet behind that, on Russian territory itself, the Ukrainians have taken the fight to the Russian state, to include oil refinery facilities, logistics infrastructure, and military headquarters, in a way that completes this 3-part offensive against the Russian campaign. So I think the momentum has clearly shifted, and I think that was reflected at the NATO summit in Ankara just several days ago.
How sustainable is this trend, and what do you think will happen on the front line next?
Well, it's quite sustainable because increasingly Ukraine is producing its own indigenous weapon systems, to include some long-range precision strike systems that even the U.S. and our Western partners have refused to provide Ukraine. So Ukraine's producing its own means now, increasingly. There are several systems, however, that Ukraine still lacks and cannot produce indigenously. Most significant, the Patriot air defense system, which is the single best defense system against Russia's ballistic missiles that are still striking Ukrainian cities. And coming out of the Ankara summit, we saw progress on that front, because President Trump announced that he intended to license the Ukrainian production of its own Patriot missiles. So this is an important first step to providing Ukraine what it so desperately needs, which is this Patriot system to defeat Russian ballistic missiles.
What else do you think Washington could be doing for Ukraine now, more out of the things that are not happening right now?
Well, that's a long list because, frankly, Washington's not doing much these days by way of supporting Ukraine. Washington's permitting European allies to purchase U.S. systems via a NATO format, and then in turn ship those that military materiel to Ukraine. We're not providing anything directly to Ukraine right now, except perhaps some intelligence that helps fuel their campaign against Russian targets. We could do more in terms of closing the sanctions, the gaps in the sanctions regime. And we have not done that. So there's a lot that we could do, both on the military front, but also on the economic front.
But why do you think this is not happening yet?
I think there's still a hesitancy, perhaps in search of a U.S. role as some sort of mediator or some sort of convener of a negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. But I think the last 18 months have proven that that's a bit of a pipe dream. There doesn't seem to be much prospect for that kind of negotiation at all. And meanwhile, our support to Ukraine has largely dried up.
We are talking just several hours after the rare in-person meeting between Secretary Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And after that meeting, Secretary Rubio said that there will need to be some new ideas to break the deadlock in talks, because proposals put forward so far were unacceptable to Ukraine and will be unacceptable to Ukraine. That's what Rubio said. Do you think that's an understanding in Washington, that it's an onset of this understanding that it is no longer possible to pressure Ukraine to accept the unacceptable?
I think Ukraine has proven that it will not surrender, that it will not give up sovereign territory, and that increasingly it has not only the will to resist, but the means to resist. And it no longer is wholly dependent on Western support. So yes, I think as we've discussed, that the momentum has very much shifted in Ukraine's favor.
But as the White House talks about the need for any new ideas, what do you think those ideas could be?
Difficult to say. And frankly, I'm skeptical that those new ideas will come out of a Washington initiative. I think that the initiative based on military progress by Ukraine is probably the most promising potential for changes on the diplomatic front. Increasingly, Russia, which remains relatively isolated on the international scene, it's also now increasingly pressured on the Russian domestic scene with gas shortages, targets even on the outskirts of Moscow itself being hit routinely. And it's become, I think, increasingly apparent that Moscow also faces a military manpower shortage because of its catastrophic losses of troops in Ukraine that confronts the Kremlin with a bit of an existential issue. And that is, are they willing to fully mobilize the Russian manpower potential in order to achieve President Putin's goals in Ukraine? It's not clear that they want to take that decision. It's certainly not clear that short of full mobilization, that Moscow can prevail. So again, the general trend here in the last 6 to 9 months has been a positive shift in Ukraine's favor.
We've seen the Alaska summit between President Trump and Vladimir Putin, but recently Russian public statements seem to be walking back any potential verbal tentative offers made at that summit when it comes to talk and peace negotiations. Do you think that Moscow chose to escalate?
Well, I think Moscow intended to escalate. We see this by way of the one avenue that they have for escalation, and that is to continue these large-scale attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. I mean, it's not unusual for an overnight attack in Ukraine to feature several hundred aircraft, drones, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and so forth. That campaign's been going on for several years now. And as we move towards the fall and into the potential of another very brutal winter, I think the Russian air campaign against energy infrastructure in Ukraine and so forth will again spike in an effort to pressure Zelensky towards concessions. I don't think that's in the cards. I don't think President Zelensky will relent, and I think he has, by and large, the support of the Ukrainian people that, again, the momentum has shifted. Ukrainians sense that. They're proud of that, and they're not sensing that now is the time to negotiate or to compromise with Russia's full-scale invasion.
And watching President Trump almost literally embracing President Zelensky at the NATO summit, where do you think this leaves Putin when it comes to this war and his relations with President Trump?
Well, I think that clearly President Putin views the results in the NATO summit negatively. I mean, not only do you have this tactical agreement about licensing the production of Patriot missiles, which Putin obviously cannot favor, but also, despite the risks that the alliance, the 32 leaders of the alliance would meet in Ankara, and that there could be divisions within the alliance over contentious issues like trade tariffs, like U.S. statements with regard to Greenland, with the Trump administration dissatisfaction with regard to how some NATO allies individually as nations were perceived as not fully supporting the war in Iran by way of base rights and overflight rights and all that. So there's a lot of potential here for division. By and large, the result of the Ankara summit is exactly what NATO intends for every summit, and that is the perception, the image of solidarity and unity. So I think NATO faced challenges going into the summit, certainly faces challenges coming out, but overall, the Kremlin can't be happy that NATO, despite these challenges, portrays a sense of solidarity and cohesion.
So we know the history of President Putin is that he likes to up the ante. So seeing that, you said that full-scale mobilization may be unlikely, but where does raising the stakes leave Putin?
Well, I think that's his problem, right? I mean, he has mobilized and placed on a war footing the Russian economy and distorted it in such a way that it'll be very difficult to reverse that trend on the Russian economy. He's isolated Russia internationally, perhaps with the exception of a junior partnership with China, so a partnership in which Russia is seen as the junior partner. He has very few international supporters, and increasingly the war with Ukraine is not going well. And Ukraine has managed to bring the fight home to the Russian people in a way that I think is very telling. So I think President Putin's list of options have narrowed dramatically, and it's not clear how he gets out of this dilemma.
You've been the ambassador to NATO. Could it be that one of the options for Putin to escalate dramatically would be to attack NATO? How likely do you think, or how possible do you think this is in the next, say, 12 to 18 months?
I don't think a conventional military attack by Russia on a NATO ally is very likely at all. And that's in part because most of his conventional military capability has been expended or is consumed right now in Ukraine. There are a couple exceptions. I mean, he does have the drone or missile capacity to strike a NATO ally. It's not clear at all what that would achieve for him, though. It would simply put him in conflict with the much greater military capacity of the NATO alliance. And it would, I think, solidify the NATO alliance in a way that we haven't seen since perhaps the immediate reaction of the alliance to the attacks on the United States on 9/11, all the way back in 2001. So I don't think a conventional military attack is likely. However, that does not dismiss a tool that the Kremlin is already using, and that is a set of what are referred to as gray zone or hybrid attacks. So these are forms of aggression short of armed attack, which of course would trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty. And these are attacks or aggressions like misinformation campaigns, election interference, interference of undersea cables, disruption of undersea cables, cyber attacks, and these sort of things. Attacks which are designed to tuck in below the level of armed attack and not trigger Article 5, but also attacks which are by nature hard to attribute back to Russia. So there's an area of ambiguity or cloudiness about who the perpetrator is. And these sorts of attacks have been going on for years, sponsored by Russia against NATO allies. And I think this is a real challenge NATO faces on the security front, how to deal with these sub-Article 5 or these hybrid attacks, which are taking place now.
And some hawkish voices in Moscow have long been saying, let's test Article 5 and let's see how NATO responds, because they will surely not go to war with Russia over this. What do you think the real NATO response would be?
Well, look, I think Kremlin understands, while there are hawkish voices on Russian television and so forth, right? I think the Kremlin fundamentally understands a reality, and that is that the brightest red line, perhaps in the global geostrategic setting, is the red line surrounding NATO territory, and that if that red line is violated, all bets are off in terms of NATO's response. And remember that NATO, sometimes NATO is misunderstood, meaning that an attack on an ally has to be agreed at full consensus. So today that would be a vote of 32-0. And that before that full consensus is achieved, nothing can happen. So, perhaps some would argue, well, NATO will flounder. NATO will doubt itself. NATO won't be responsive in the face of an attack. But the reality is, and a careful reading of the NATO treaty reveals, that it's the attack itself which triggers a response by all 32 allies, and that Article 5 even includes the clause, individually and collectively, meaning that each of the 32 allies has an individual responsibility to come to the assistance of any of the others which are attacked. And then beyond that, of course, there's the potential for a collective response. So,
and you think they will not hesitate?
I think they will not hesitate. And remember, they don't have to agree at 32. It's the attack that triggers the response. And in fact, this was demonstrated in the only time that Article 5 was actually invoked, and that is on the day after 9/11 in Brussels headquarters, when NATO agreed. At that time, I think there were 28 allies, right? Agreed that the attack on Washington and New York by al-Qaeda on 9/11 actually qualified as a collective response. But even before that vote as a collective response, the allies had a responsibility to support the United States individually. And in fact, later, subsequent to 9/11, when allies responded by supporting the U.S. military campaign in Afghanistan, they did it both collectively and individually. Some provided military support, some provided financial support, some provided diplomatic support, and so forth. So the treaty is written very wisely in a way that must impose doubt on the part of any potential aggressor as to exactly what NATO's response would be, and therefore, ideally and deliberately deter such an attack in the first place.
Before Ukraine, Putin, of course, launched a war in Georgia in 2008, and we're coming up to the anniversary of this war literally in 2 weeks. And now, 18 years later, looking back at this, and probably with a hindsight of what happened in Ukraine later, do you think that the Bush administration's response to that war was adequate and the U.S. did enough to help Georgia?
Well, I think you can go back even a year before the 2008 invasion by Russia of Georgia and the seizing of two Georgian provinces, which Russia continues to occupy today, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, right? Even before that 2008 event, we should have paid closer attention to what Vladimir Putin said in the Munich Security Conference in February of 2007, where he clearly laid out his game plan. And perhaps the most often repeated quote from that session was that the greatest catastrophe from Putin's perspective was the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so the message was clear in 2007. He demonstrated it in 2008. in Georgia. I would argue he demonstrated it again in 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the destabilizing of the Donbass, what his game plan is. And his game plan is essentially, as much as possible, to protect the near abroad, in his view, to resurrect as much as possible the Soviet Russian traditional empire in the near abroad, and to subjugate those nearby states. This is obviously now blatantly obvious after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But the game plan here has been evident for some period. Now, look, as you and I discussed, hindsight is always very clear and obvious, right? So these signposts were not as obvious perhaps in 2007 and 2008. But I think history will be clear that more could have been done and more should have been done in 2008 and again in 2014 in the case of Ukraine that might have increased the likelihood that Putin would be deterred from what he did in 22. But of course, that's a subjective judgment that historians will have to struggle with.
Could it be that the war in Ukraine now, or the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, is a similar warning sign of what Putin may dream about doing later, the same way as Georgia in 2008 could have been a precursor to Ukraine in 2014?
Well, I think the difference in the 2022 invasion and the current situation is that the Russian state has now mobilized in a way that has essentially all his poker chips pressed into the center of the table to achieve his objectives in Ukraine, and he is failing. And it's quite clear that he will fail in Ukraine. So it's not clear that what more he can do, except perhaps, as I mentioned earlier, as a hypothetical, to fully mobilize Russian manpower. But that brings home to every Russian family in a way that he does not want politically to do. He does not want to bring home this war to every Russian family. So he's avoided that to this point. It's not clear how much longer he can avoid this, and it's not clear how the Russian people would respond. So he has few options remaining in terms of escalation.
And what is the likeliest option in terms of escalation, do you think, for him now?
Well, I think he'll try to persist. I think he'll try to make this, again, a very tough winter on the Ukrainian people, hoping for a crack or a fissure in the solidarity of the Ukrainian political support for continuing the war. He can continue to try to do that. He will hang on very closely to his support base with China in an effort to keep that one active partnership, a meaningful partnership alive. But frankly, his options going forward are more and more narrow, thanks to the initiative that the Ukrainians have seized.